Boxy, Boxy. We're live. We have company. Hi, I'm Larry Harnisch, and this is Boxy. There you go. I'm going to get a better shot of Boxy. Boxy is the Los Angeles County District Attorney's files in the Black Dahlia case. I'm Larry Harnisch, as I said. This is the monthly Ask Me Anything about George Hodel and Steve Hodel. Only George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions. The Black Dahlia session is the first Tuesday of the month, and the next one will be in May, which is May 6th, 2025. And the next George Hodel chat will be May 20th, 2025. I started doing the Ask Me Anything because I got fed up with the dismal nature of the true crime industrial complex. I don't generally give interviews. I got pitched to do a video last week. And I said, maybe. I said, if it's going to be something other than the usual Black Dahlia project, maybe. Anyway, hey, Sheila. But I had to split, because I was getting so many George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions that I split it off into a separate George Hodel and Steve Hodel session. And so this is where we are. And I will say right now, the chat is on super slow to deter trolls. I usually get some. Any harassment and you will go away. And remember, this is Ask Me Anything. It's not Tell Me Anything. This is like not more of a comment than a question. No, don't do that. Skepticism is fine. Argumentative questions are not very helpful. Okay, very quickly, who am I? 34 years in journalism, 27 at the Los Angeles Times. I did a lot of things. I was a copy editor. I was in charge of other copy editors. I wrote feature stories. I had a column for a while. I generally wrote about Los Angeles history, and that was what the blog was about. So my passion is research and fact checking, and we're going to talk about that today. So that's kind of who I am. Now, I have to start with a warning here. Okay, got a warning, and I have to read this to you. This is from Wikipedia, which says, Larry Harnisch is an infamous debunker of the most popular theory surrounding George Hodel, who was one of the prime and most likely suspects. His claims against the validity of George Hodel are so through ad hominem, Latin. That means attacking the man. Ad hominem fallacies against Steve Hodel and self-declared independent research rather than personal history and facts. We're going to talk about independent research. By the way, I caught Steve Hodel editing Wikipedia. Naughty Steve, don't do that. Notice that I didn't delete anything about me, and this was a very minor edit. Steve changed his dad's name in Wikipedia from George Hodel Jr. To George Hodel. George Hodel was a junior. His birth name was George Hill Hodel Jr. He often went by G. Hill Hodel. In case you're in, and that will come up if you're doing research on Georgie. He didn't go by George Hodel a lot. He for a long time he went by G. Hill Hodel. Okay. So let's begin. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to research. It's kind of generally a general application for research, but specifically with George Hodel and Steve Hodel. And I have to remind everybody, number one, everything you think you know about George Hodel comes from Steve. All of it, either directly through or indirectly through articles, interviews with him. He has some helpers who do research. One of the most interesting ones is a guy who calls himself Luigi Warren. And Luigi spent gobs and gobs and gobs of time linking George Hodel, little Georgie, at the age of, I think he was 13 or 14, to some infamous murder case up in the Bay Area. So Steve has helpers who kind of contribute things about his dad. Okay. So, yeah, independent research. I have been fact-checking Steve Hodel for 22 years, ever since publication of Black Dahlia Avenger. That's right. History and research is my jam. I don't know everything that Steve Hodel says. I've listened to podcasts. I have read those books. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. The average person who doesn't know anything about the Black Dahlia case or law enforcement or the legal profession or the medical profession cannot imagine just how much he lies. Ooh, ad hominem attacks. Okay, but we're going to see how that comes about. Okay, where do you begin? Let's talk about independent research in the matter of George Hodel and Steve Hodel. Okay, where in this day and age in 2025 are you going to do? Where are you going to do your research? Okay, not Google. Goodbye. Night boy. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Where do you start your research? Okay. Nothing after publication of Black Dahlia Avenger. So any of your research has to be before 2003. Okay. All of it. So where do you begin? Where do you start with your research? Well, okay. If you can't go to Google, if you can't use Wikipedia, what do you do? Okay. Here's what I do. I use Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, and Genealogy Bank. Yes, those are all subscription services. And you're going to say, Larry, what if I don't want to subscribe to Ancestry.com? What if I don't want to subscribe to newspapers.com? What do I do? You have alternatives. Okay, I highly recommend FamilySearch.org. Okay, and this would be for any genealogical thing. If you don't know what FamilySearch.org is, it's run by the Church of Latter-day Saints. It's the Mormons. They have a lot of good documents. And I have to say, I actually got the death certificate of Ruth Spalding, George Hodel, the secretary that George Hodel supposedly killed. Okay. I got that. I'm pretty sure I got that off of FamilySearch.org. They have a lot of material. They certainly will have the basics. Okay. That will be free. You can sign up and that will get you started for sure. The other place you can start is your public library. If you don't have a library card, get a public library card. Get a library card. Most libraries have some sort of newspaper archive that you can access freely. Maybe ProQuest. It may be the local papers. You have to be, you can be a little more creative. Let's say you get to the point where you're looking for phone books. Now, Ancestry.com has phone books, but the LA Public Library also has phone books, and they're free. You just have to. Part of the trick is you just have to know that these things exist. So if you were going to do George Hodel independently, okay, where would you begin? Well, first of all, birth and death dates. Okay, you want to know, and this would be true of anybody. When were they born? When were they died? Okay, when did they die? Okay, who were their parents? Did they have any siblings? In George Hodel's case, no, he was an only child. And then you would start to fill in the blanks from there. And with someone whose life was as complicated, or if you're, and my belief is my style of research is to go narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow. Narrow and deep is my kind of research. And so I would take the life of George Hodel. I built up a timeline of George Hodel's life over the years. I've got a pretty good idea of what he was doing. And the way you do that is, okay, you've got the birth and the death dates, fine. The census records are every 10 years. You can see where an individual was living, who were they living with. And there was all kinds of interesting information that you could get. If you can interpret the census records correctly, which can be tricky, there's a lot of information there. One year they asked, what was the value of the home? Did they rent? How much was the rent? If they owned a home, what was the value of the home? There, one time they asked, what was your pay? How much money did you make in the last year or whatever? And that can be revealing. Certainly, it's revealing of George Hodel and supposedly how wealthy he was. When you look at, and he was doing okay, but he wasn't rolling in dough. So those will fill in the blanks. But again, that's every 10 years. And if you want to fill in a little bit more, California voter registration, California voter records. Those are every 2 years. Again, those are on Ancestry. I'm not sure whether Ancestry.com or FamilySearch.org has California voter records, but they are on Ancestry.com, and you can get them. And again, it's useful to see where people lived and who was living in the same address. And another thing you can get on Ancestry.com is immigration records. You can see, for example, with George Hodel, you can see when he came back into the country, when he left. Again, you have to be very careful in differentiating between George Sr. and George Jr. That's the thing about historical research, is you got to be careful of that. And I'm somewhat certain there was another George Hodel floating around Los Angeles at the time. The other thing that the LA Public Library has is city directories. They stopped in 1942 with World War II, and they don't resume until the 1950s. But if you're looking for that kind of information, that is at the LA Public Library. All you have to do is go to the website. You do not need a library card, and that's useful. School records. Caltech, you'd have to know that George Hodel went to Caltech. And then you can find the annual, the student annual. Caltech has digitized all that stuff. You can go to Caltech and you can see when was George Hodel a student. What was his? I think he was general studies. That's my recollection. But you can see that, and you can see he was only there for 1 year. By the same token, you can go to the biennial catalog. When he was a student at was it University of San Francisco? I think it was University of San Francisco. You can see what the graduation requirements were for medical school. There's a breakdown. You can see to graduate from medical school, you need so many hours of this and so many hours of that and so many hours of that. And so you will now know that when Steve Hodel says, yeah, my father had 700 and something hours of surgery, it's like, yeah, that's what everybody had. That was the minimum to graduate from medical school. So that is how you would begin to go about doing the research. The newspapers, again, nothing before 2003. Just stay away. But if you have access to newspapers.com or Genealogy Bank, those two have pretty much all the Los Angeles papers are online now. There's an interesting exception where the Examiner, the Los Angeles Examiner for 1947 isn't online. They don't have that. But the rest of the two Hearst papers, the Examiner and the Herald Express, except for January 47, and the Herald Express for January 47 is online. And then you've got the Daily News and the Los Angeles Times. But what if you don't have those? What if you don't have the Los Angeles papers? What can you do? Well, the Black Dahlia case was big enough that pretty much every paper carried the AP, a wire story, the Associated Press. A lot of papers carried stories, for example, about Dorothy Hodel being arrested and put in jail for neglecting Steve and his brothers, because it's all the children's authors. Children's author goes to jail for neglecting children. That got pretty wide press. So even if you don't have access to the Los Angeles papers from your local library, you will find something. It's a good starting place. But again, in every case, I would say nothing before 2003, and then you can get into the oh wow, I didn't know that. The thing about Ancestry.com that you have to be careful of is that Steve, one thing you have to remember about Steve is that he has spent the last 22 years tirelessly, unceasingly campaigning to make turn his dad into one of America's most prolific serial killers. He has gone everywhere. So he's all over Ancestry.com making comments about how his dad was a serial killer. It's all through Ancestry. You just have to turn it off. You just have to tune that out. And one thing I've learned about fact checking Steve so much is that he is horrible with details. He's absolutely terrible. And the example is George Hodel, his dad, came through immigration on an airplane flight. He got on, and I forget what the airline was, but he came back I think it was from the Philippines on an airplane. Okay. So he had to go through customs, right? Steve has got this long screed on this document about how his dad came back this is when he was on a ship and he had such and such a cabin. And it's like, no, Steve, this isn't a ship. It's an airplane. Can't you tell? I mean, really, that is one of the things I've learned from following Steve, fact checking Steve Hodel for 22 years is he can't handle details. He's horrible with details. He's not a detail person at all. Anyway, but immigration records are important. Now, another thing you can find, and I happen to have this as one of my favorite examples. During World War II, men had to register for the draft. And here's George Hodel's draft registration. Notice the handwriting. Right, which fingers? Oh, there we are, right there. Steve has gone into great detail about a handwriting analysis comparing this to various notes that were mailed I think it was to the police. I think it's the Degnan case. I'm not quite sure now, but he's compared this handwriting. Okay, he will show this, and see, this handwriting is like this. See how similar it is? Okay, what he doesn't show you is, and I love this, the back of the form. Okay, the handwriting isn't George Hodel's handwriting. It belongs to Emma Vreeland. Okay, so Steve won't tell you that. Steve won't tell you that, oh, that's not my dad's handwriting. That's how he is. He does that kind of thing all the time. Okay, Boxy here. Let me address Boxy for a minute. Yes, dear Boxy. Boxy here came from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. And this is almost everything that the district attorney had in its files. And I was allowed to photocopy it. The only thing I didn't photocopy was the body shots of Elizabeth Short. I wasn't allowed to photocopy them, and that's fine. And the other thing I didn't copy was some of the crackpot mail. There's a lot of it. This is no longer possible. You can no longer photocopy the files. My understanding is that the district attorney's office, if you file a Freedom of Information request, you send in a blank CD if you can find one, and they return it with the information. That's what I'm told. I have no personal experience with the district attorney's media relations office. The person I knew there, Sandy Gibbons, retired years ago, so I don't know how the office operates now. That's how I did it. But that's really the more detailed stuff. And the most helpful thing in here is the transcripts of the bug of George Hodel's house. In case you don't know, after he was found not guilty of molesting his daughter, the police and the district attorney's office put him under surveillance. They put a microphone in his house. They had him under surveillance for 5.5 weeks, and they gave up. It was boring. They just turned off the lights and went away. Okay. I have posted all of that on my blog. It's all there, verbatim. I haven't edited it to juice it up, which is what Steve Hodel will do. Again, one of my favorite examples of Steve is there's a line in the transcripts where a technician said, I had trouble with one reel. And Steve edits that to have his dad say, I'm in trouble. No, it was a guy having trouble with the equipment. You you have to understand who you're dealing with. And you will, if you go through this independent research, you will find very quickly that what kind of person Steve Hodel is. Okay. All right. I've kind of ranted and raved enough about individual research, but do independent research. Don't take my word for it. Take Black Dahlia Avenger and research it. Fact check it. But I mean, you really need to do it at the molecular level. And I should say, let's say you don't want to research George Hodel. You might want to branch out. You might want to research the history of the Soudan House. Again, stay off Google, stay off Wikipedia. It's not reliable. Okay. Go to the newspapers, check and see what was the activity at the address on Franklin. Who lived there? Go to the census records. Who lived there? Who were they? How were they related? There's a lot you can do, but it's time. You have to have the kind of mindset where you really enjoy research and kind of digging through stuff. But again, I would highly recommend going narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow, because then you'll get lost. Okay. Let's see. Why does Steve think the handwriting on the envelope looking like his dad's? I saw the comparison and it doesn't look similar to me. Well, okay. Here's the deal with in the real world as opposed to the alternative reality of Steve Hodel. Only what we're talking about here is about 2 weeks, 20 days, 2 weeks after, but 20 days, 2 weeks after, I forget what, anyway, after she was killed, the killer took a little envelope, addressed it with cutout letters from the newspapers, and mailed some of Elizabeth Short's property back to the Los Angeles Examiner and other newspapers. That is the only mailing that is legitimate. There was a lot of crackpot mail. I've seen it. It's not all online. The LA Public Library has posted images of some of this crackpot mail, but it's from crackpots. Taunting the police was a big deal. So anyway, Steve is great for recognizing his dad's handwriting. That's one of his default positions. So yeah, but again, remember that Steve Hodel will do a handwriting comparison to this. Whoops, come back here, you. Steve will do a handwriting comparison to this when it's really not his dad's handwriting. It's Emma Vreeland, Okay. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. You once mentioned that Steve acquired his Elizabeth Short photographs off eBay. How did this happen? How long after the sale did you find out about it? Oh, immediately. Here's the story. There was a guy who collected vintage. The guy was really into vintage motorcycles. Okay. And he would go to various flea markets and look for old pictures of antique motorcycles. That was his thing. He was going through these photographs and he noticed some. He recognized them as photographs from the Black Dahlia case. Okay. They're original. They were taken out of Elizabeth Short's scrapbook. There was kind of a feeding frenzy when her scrapbooks were taken from her luggage. The police grabbed some, the newspapers grabbed some. They just ripped her scrapbooks to pieces. And these photographs were probably in the collection of one of the newspapers. And this guy recognized them. He bought them for very little, whatever the guy was asking for that was selling the antique photos. But he recognized them and he listed them on eBay. And he listed them as Black Dahlia photos and all that kind of thing. And there was a lot of bidding. I dropped out very early. You know, I think I didn't have that kind of money. I think the most I think the most I put up was 300, something like that. And Steve ended up, I think his final payment was $7,600, which was his entire advance from Black Dahlia Avenger. Yeah, Steve blew the entire advance from that book on those photographs, and I outed him immediately. I did screen grabs, I did screen caps of the images. I duped the web pages. I have them on my old blog, lmharnisch.com. I have all that, and so you can see that. And the reason I did it is because ad hominem attack coming. Steve Hodel is such a duplicitous person that he would not be above buying some Elizabeth Short photos on eBay and saying, "Oh, I found them in my dad's stuff. See, this is proof." That's the kind of person he is. You have to know who you're dealing with, and so that's why. So I knew immediately that he had done it. And you know, Steve being Steve, he's a, well, I understand Larry Harnisch is very upset about it. No, I mean, the only thing I was upset about is those should not be in private hands. Those should be in a photo archive or someplace. But you know, beyond that, okay. If you were dropped into the LAPD in 1947 and were able to hold sway over how the investigation happened, with a nod to the complicated and inevitable ties between the department and organized crime, how would you have gone about it differently? Okay, I'm not going to address that. I'm just going to do the part about the complicated and inevitable ties between the department and organized crime. No. That whole, the LAPD was corrupt. The LAPD, no. You will not find that. People like to cite the Brenda Allen case. And I will say right now, okay, did Brenda Allen, the Hollywood madam, did she kill anybody? No. Was she investigated by the homicide division? No. Who was she investigated by? Vice Squad. Okay, that's a completely different realm of the LAPD. The homicide guys only do homicides. So get over the whole inevitable ties between the department no, let go of that. No. And that's because, and I say that because Steve Hodel will go on and on about, you know, LA was a real LA, you know, LA Confidential, and the department was corrupt. It's like, no, that's not true. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Okay. Well, since I didn't know about my heritage, I will definitely stay away from it. Why did George Hodel go to the Southwest and any luck finding medical records? Why switch to county health and VD? Okay. He did not switch. George Hodel's specialty was public health and venereal disease. When you look at his training, you will see that he had postgraduate work in venereal disease. That was his specialty. And so when he was in New Mexico, you will see that he was a public health doctor doing, let's see, I think rabies, tuberculosis, and venereal and VD. And I highly recommend, if you can get into a newspaper archive, research George Hodel, research his time in New Mexico. Remember, he went by G. Hill Hodel a lot of the time rather than George Hodel. But yeah, do the research, see what he was doing. Okay. Did Man Ray kill Elizabeth Short? No. It's amazing to me that somebody would even think that, but no, that didn't happen. No. Okay. Did Steve's mother live to see the book published, and did she ever speak publicly about it? I would have to go over to my cheat sheet here and see that. Hang on a second here. I forget when she died. I'll be honest with you. I forget when she. Okay. You know what? I'm not going to take the time to do that now. I don't think so. I think she was long gone. I don't quite remember now. I would have to look that up. I don't think so. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. I don't get the killer being labeled with the word Avenger in the first place. Wouldn't the person bringing the killer to justice be the Black Dahlia Avenger, as in avenging her murder? The title makes no sense. Exactly. As I said, there was a lot of crackpot mail. The only authentic mailing was the one with the cutout letters from the newspapers that had her stuff. All the rest were the work of crackpots and cranks. And Black Dahlia Avenger was one of the crackpot messages. And if you go to the LA Public Library public website and look at the photographs, you will see that there's a picture of a guy, Armand Robles, and he said his photograph was stolen and put on there. It's a scam. It was a joke. It was a prank that got taken seriously. No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Let's see. I have one question. How did your coworkers at the LA Times feel about Steve Hodel's claims? Were they skeptical or more trusting? Oh, totally skeptical. I had one reporter who covers, and I think he's still there, covered the LAPD, and I mean his take was that I wonder if they're going to go back and reopen some of Steve's old cases to see if he phonied them up because his Black Dahlia stuff is so goofy. That's the reality. And Steve gets very upset when I say this, but he is a pariah within the LAPD. He really is. There is a whole litany. I can do a list like this of retired homicide detectives who say he's full of it. There isn't anybody who says he knows what he's talking about. So I mean, it's 100% the LAPD, and it's not they're covering up to protect these old police chiefs that nobody's heard of anymore. It's just they know they've got his number. They know he's a self-promoting huckster. It's that simple. Let's see. A quick question for today's Ask Me Anything on George Hodel, if you can fit it in. In the past, you have mentioned Stephen K. and his take on Steve Hodel's cases against his father. But could you walk us through the arc of K's shifting position on the Hodel case? I'm also curious. I forget whether K was still in the DA's office when he first endorsed Steve Hodel's solution. Yes, Stephen K. was still at the district attorney's office when Black Dahlia Avenger was published. The district attorney at the time was Stephen Cooley, and Stephen K. and Steve Hodel went in and made their dog and pony show for George Hodel killing Elizabeth Short and Jean French. Jean French was killed on February 10th, almost a month later. She was beaten and stomped to death. And I will tell you now, when you get these two ladies on the autopsy table, and I've read the autopsies of both of them, what record is available to the public anyway, and it's night and day. There is absolutely no similarity at all between those two killings, none. But Stephen K. went in and he said, but Stephen K. is not an idiot. What did he say? Based on this evidence. Oh, based on this evidence. So he's laying it on Steve Hodel to be accurate. Well, Steve Hodel isn't accurate. We know that. So it's based on this evidence I would file. So that's Stephen K's thing. The important thing is that Stephen K. wrote a letter to Ed Jokish, the retired LAPD captain, who butted heads with Steve. And Stephen K. said, I don't believe Steve Hodel's claims of a cover-up within the LAPD. I don't believe there was, I don't believe any of that at all. So that's sort of Steve world. And again, Steve doesn't tell you that. He just says, oh yeah, I was endorsed by Stephen K. But that's that is the let's see, that's kind of that's as much as I know. Stephen Kay retired in 2005, 2 years after publication of Black Dahlia Avenger. I think he went and worked as I think he worked for one of the smaller communities in Los Angeles. Remember, Los Angeles is a big metropolitan area, and there are lots of little cities within Los Angeles. And I think he went to work as a city attorney, something like that, for one of these smaller communities. But that's it. I don't know anything beyond that. So okay. Why did the LAPD not follow up on Ralph Asdale's suspect? I don't know. They had lots and lots of suspects, and I know Ralph because Ralph was a friend of mine. I was at Paul Barrett's funeral, and Ralph felt very strongly that he identified a good suspect, and he was kind of disgusted that they didn't follow up on it. But let me point out the difference. What did Ralph do? Ralph developed a guy that he thought was a suspect. Okay. He turned it over to the homicide guys, and it was their business what they were going to do with it. Okay. Let's contrast that with Paul DeRiver. Okay. Paul DeRiver gets poor old Leslie Dillon. He gets a letter from Leslie Dillon and decides, oh, Leslie Dillon did the murder under a split personality. Let's go do this independent investigation. And I'm not going to tell homicide. I'm not going to tell the lead detectives, Harry Hansen and Finest Brown. I'm going to do my own investigation. And to help me, I'm going to get the gangster squad. And I'm going to get, so yeah, Paul DeRiver totally violated all protocols, all practices to do the Leslie Dillon thing. And guess what? It blew up. It totally blew up. It did not end well. Okay. Does Steve Hodel have any evidence George Hodel was even in the country during the murders like Zodiac? Oh, no. Steve is very flexible about evidence. Let's take, for example, the murder of Suzanne Degnan. Okay. Who is Suzanne Degnan? Suzanne Degnan has kind of gotten dragged into the Black Dahlia case because Elizabeth Short's body was found a few blocks from Degnan. And in the parallel reality of Steve Hodel, George Hodel killed this little girl in January of 1946. Horrible, horrible killing. And then a year later, left Elizabeth Short's body as a pointer to this Degnan Street a couple of blocks away. Steve has gotten to the point where he will say that Degnan and Norton, Elizabeth Short was famously left on Norton. Steve will say that Elizabeth Short's body was left on Degnan, and that Degnan and Norton are the same street. It's like, again, it is this alternative universe that we call Steve World. Anyway, you would think that if Steve Hodel was going to actually go about establishing that his father committed this murder, he would do some basic groundwork, like saying, oh yeah, my dad was in Chicago on these dates. He doesn't do any of that. That's really unimportant to him. And if you unpack this a little bit, and first of all, I have to say about the Suzanne Degnan murder, as stupid as this idea is, Steve stole it. There was a guy with a crackpot website. It's defunct. And I mentioned it before. He wrote to me as Jack Pico. That wasn't his name. He used the name Jack Pico. And he had the idea that Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton Avenue as a pointer to Degnan and the Suzanne Degnan killing. But let's say you were going to do this, okay? In 1946. What would you do? Okay, you would have to find somebody in Chicago, we'll say. You go through the phone book, right? And find somebody named Degnan. Okay. And do they have a little girl? Okay, great. You would have to do all of that and then somehow get to Chicago and do this murder and then get away with it. I mean, it just the logistics of trying to do that in 1946 without the internet or anything else, it's just so far-fetched. But Steve doesn't bother with any of that stuff. Steve at this point has established his dad as this, world traveling serial killer. It's just, dad took off whenever he wanted to. And I'm sure he was in San Francisco conveniently on these dates. But he doesn't worry about any of that. Okay. Let's talk about this very briefly. Okay. Steve will tell you this is a police composite. No, it's an illustration off a book jacket. Okay. He won't tell you that. I mean, maybe begrudgingly he will say, oh yeah, it's an illustration off a book jacket. But he doesn't worry about the fuzzy little details. He can't be bothered with that. It's pretty amazing. So no. Do you think the killer had to be a surgeon, or could a venereal disease doctor have done it? Well, Andre, I'll tell you what. I'm at the point of the book where I'm talking about the autopsy, and I have been reading the different versions of Elizabeth Short's autopsy, because there are several. Let me say what they are very quickly. There was one that was read into the public record at the inquest. It's incomplete because Frederick Newbar, the autopsy surgeon, got interrupted. There's another one in the LAPD summary of the case. There's another one, a little nebulous, from In Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer. So there's three. And, having read a lot on autopsies, because I'm a lay person, read a lot on that, autopsies, and going over trying to decrypt the autopsy report for a lay person, which I am. I don't think there's any question that it was a surgeon. It was, and that was the finding of the autopsy surgeon, Frederick Newbar. He said, yeah, it's a fine piece of surgery. So as crazy as what was done to Elizabeth Short, it was for sure done by a surgeon. And George Hodel's specialty, his postgraduate training was not in surgery. It was in venereal disease. That was his specialty. Which Hodel brother was a disc jockey? That was the oldest one. That was Michael. There's three brothers, Michael, Steve, and Kelvin. And Steve was actually a twin. His twin brother died in infancy. But there were three. And Michael was the older one. Okay, let's see. Okay. You mentioned the Philippine branch of the Hodel family are outraged at Steve's accusations. Are most of the American Hodels on Steve's side or not? Well, a lot of the Hodels are really quiet. Okay. There are, I mean, if you really want to get into granular research, one of the fun things you could do is try to keep track of all of George Hodel's spouses and kids and all that kind of thing. He had a lot of kids. It's really hard to keep track. He was married, I think, 4 times, something like that. So it's a lot of people to keep track of. The Philippine branch, for sure. Some of them just don't say anything. Steve's got a couple of boys, and I'm relying on my memory here. I think one of my recollection, though, is that one of Steve's kids was particularly bright and was actually a contestant on Jeopardy. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. That's my recollection. His kids have never said a word about Steve's claim, his theories. The general, like, the genealogy, the family tree of Steve's claims are this. Okay. Black Dahlia Avenger comes out. Okay. Big splash, best-selling book. Okay. So various members, one branch of the family really embraces it, and that's Tamar. Tamar is Steve's older half-sister. hard to keep them straight. And there was a lot of bad blood between Tamar and Steve over Black Dahlia Avenger over what he wrote in there. And I'm told that he found, by people who know Tamar better than I did, that he found a way to calm her down. But that whole Tamar branch of the family, Fauna number one, totally on board. Fauna was interesting in that, and Fauna's life story was the basis of I Am the Night. Fauna got a couple of friends and she asked them independently of me, to do, again, independent research. Okay, research independently to see if there's anything to Uncle Steve's claims. And they came back and told her, no, there isn't. They did a lot more digging, for example, in the Man Ray material, the stuff that I haven't really looked at, that kind of thing. But they came back and told her exactly the same thing. And for whatever reason, Fauna went ahead and incorporated all of Steve's claims into her own life story. She just scooped it all up and made that. And to me, Fauna Hodel had an interesting life story on her own. Her mom handed her off to a washroom attendant in Nevada, and told the people the woman was black. Well, she's mixed race. One day she'll darken. That was the title of the book. So Fauna Hodel is white, being raised thinking she was black. I mean, in this day and age, that's a fascinating story. But it wasn't enough. So she added all of Steve's Black Dahlia Avenger claims. And that has been passed on to her daughters, Yvette and Rasha. They got interviewed for Root of Evil, which was the companion podcast to I Am the Night. Root of Evil, if you're a fan of that, was totally scripted by a guy named Zach Levitt. And they ripped off some friends of mine for some of their information. I'm really unhappy with that. But again, they were handed a script. They were told what to say. It wasn't that they actually remembered any of this stuff. They were either too young to remember it, or, George wasn't around. But they have just sort of capitalized it. So for that branch of the family, it's sort of like, lying about George Hodel is kind of the family business. But Tamar had other kids. You don't hear anything much about them. I mean, the most they'll say is that Tamar was a liar and a manipulator. They do say that, but the other kid, Fauna too. Tamar had two kids. Fauna one, and I think she has two daughters, Fauna 1 and Fauna 2. There are other kids. They haven't really talked about Steve's claims too much. They have said publicly that Tamar was a liar and a manipulator, that's not a hard call. But beyond that, not really. So, and again, as I said, Duncan, the oldest half sibling, never talked to Steve again. He was so furious over Black Dahlia Avenger, he never talked to him again. So there's a lot of bad blood in the Hodel family over it. They haven't all made it public. I think I mentioned that I either heard from Tamar or someone claiming to be Tamar. And that was not a conversation I wanted to pursue. I heard from Fauna number 2 or someone claiming to be Fauna number 2. And again, that was not a conversation I particularly wanted to have. It was especially the communication from Fauna number 2. It was very strange and not something that was definitely not a conversation I wanted to pursue whatsoever. So I don't know. There are a lot of Hodel kids. We know that because when George Hodel died, his money was divided up, his estate. Most of it, of course, went to his wife, as that's how inheritance works. But there were a lot of kids, and I think each of the kids got, I'm going to say 10,000. I'm not sure if it was that much, something like that, something like $10,000, something like that. But that was that. So again, the Hodel family, my understanding from people who know them better, they're not close. They don't hang out together. They're spread all over the place. which makes sense if you've got multiple spouses and multiple kids. And George Hodel never seemed to be really interested in being a dad, at least with, and I have to fault, if George Hodel had a fault, it was, no, he wasn't a sadistic torturer of women. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't kill his secretary. It was that he didn't get custody of Steve and his brothers. Steve's mom was a drunk. And regardless of what Steve says about living in the Soudan house and remembering the glittery cocktail parties with a who's who of Hollywood, none of that happened. Steve's parents were divorced. He never lived in the Soudan house. He certainly wasn't living there, as he said. Well, we were living there, and when Elizabeth Short was killed, but we were away. We were visiting a relative. No, that's not true. He was living with his mom and his brothers, and that's the reality. But Steve has made this, as I call it, it's this alternative reality. I call it Steve World. The other thing I will mention very quickly that Ancestry.com has is medical directories, and they come out virtually every year. So if you want to kind of track where George Hodel was living, you can see what his addresses were, where he lived in Manila. And if you want to then plot where the actual address and where these killings in the Philippines took place, you'll find it a lot farther away. By the same token, you can look up Steve's address. You can look up George's address when he moved back to San Francisco. Steve will tell you that my father had the penthouse where he could see Mountain View Cemetery, where Elizabeth Short was buried. No, that's all. No, that's Looney Tunes. We know the medical directory of California came out every year. It has his address. It's not the penthouse. And you look at the building, and that didn't have a view of the cemetery in Oakland. It's a total fantasy. Okay. Well, folks, we're coming up on the 11 o'clock hour. Was George Hodel and Man Ray really close friends or not? No, they were not close friends. I mean, Man Ray's situation, he was an expatriate. He had been living in Paris. He fled ahead of the Nazis. He was in Los Angeles for a few years. He grabbed what he could. He left a lot of things behind in his studio. I have talked to someone who is really a Man Ray scholar, who is not at all supportive of Steve's claims. And where Steve has made Man Ray and sort of the Olin Mills of the Hodel family. Oh, he was the family photographer. He took all these pictures, blah, blah, blah. No. None of it worked that way. They had a very tangential business relationship. You have to understand, George Hodel was an only child. He was kind of pampered. His folks had money. Dad invested in real estate, hint, hint. And so George wasn't really that concerned about money. He was kind of a wannabe bohemian, wanna be artsy. He liked to surround himself with artsy bohemian people. That's why he had all these folks living in the Soudan house. And so, yeah, he would cultivate Man Ray and have him take some pictures, buy some pictures. And I think he bought a sculpture, something like that. But Steve has, in typical fashion, just pulled this stuff out of the air. This is how Steve does research. He was thumbing through a book of Man Ray photos and sees this one called The Minotaur. Doesn't do any research about the history of the photograph, nothing. He said, aha. Well, it turns out that this photograph was done for a Parisian art magazine called The Minotaur and had very, very limited circulation. And it would be virtually impossible for George Hodel to have seen this picture. But that's not an obstacle in the parallel world of Steve Hodel. It's just, oh yeah, just by flipping through a book. And he even has gone so far as to say, well, Man Ray could have told my father about the photograph. It's like, so no, it's, Steve will inflate, and I've done a video pretty early on about Steve Hodel's techniques for lying. He exaggerates everything. Anything that has like a kernel of accuracy, he will blow it up into, oh yeah, my dad and Man Ray were best buddies. And I should mention also, when Steve talks about, oh yeah, my dad was friends with Ben Hecht. Oh, really? Let's go to the online library, the document finder in the Newberry Library of all the Ben Hecht material. Do you think there's a mention of Ben Hecht? No, there is not. Let's go to the online directory of all the Man Ray stuff. Is there a mention of George Hodel? Very briefly. I think there's some communication from George trying to Man Ray's widow, trying to authenticate a sculpture so he can get some more money for it. I've talked to people who, one of the Man Ray, who's gone through the Man Ray, notebooks and stuff, and there isn't anything about George Hodel. It's all Steve World. It's all Steve World. Okay, well, thanks for showing up. It's always fun, and I hope that I provided some instruction on independent research rather than just ad hominem attacks. And we'll do this again in a month. So thanks a lot, everybody. And I'm going to say adios for now. Okay, see everybody later. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Always welcome. Notorious Boxy. See that? They're talking about you, Boxy. Okay. Again, next one is on Elizabeth Short. That is May 6th. Did I say May 6th? Yeah, May 6th. Okay. See you later.